Welcome to The Reality Taboo. It's June 1st, 2024. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. Today's topic, of course, is going to be the recent criminal convictions of Donald J. Trump. So, Ness, as we record this, it's been about 48 hours since the verdict was announced. What are your thoughts?
Well, The Reality Taboo, we called this. This was a putative bookkeeping case that would have been a misdemeanor in any other case that was elevated to a felony, but only after it had passed by multiple people who were in positions to prosecute it who elected not to because the case was so ridiculous, so lacking in any meaningful evidentiary threshold. This is NKVD. This is Beria. Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Even Alvin Bragg initially wasn't going to bring the prosecution because the lack of evidence was so overwhelming. The case was so risible on its face. And I think, too, Jeff informed me that this is outside the statute of limitations. So really every legal norm, every standard that's expected of the judicial system was thrown out the window here. The judge overseeing the case is a blatant partisan. It was in Manhattan, which is one of the most liberal, democratic cities, boroughs, areas in the country. For those of us in flyover country, calling it a borough as part of a city seems a little bit of an incorrect way to describe it because it's a borough that has a larger population than several states in the country, and it voted close to 90% for Biden and for Clinton in 2020 and 2016. And there's so much in this story coming together that we've touched on previously, that the system was not going to permit Trump to be elected president, and whatever pretense was necessary, that pretense would be found, that there would be an escalation. And this is still a step or two removed from the JFK treatment. If this doesn't do it, I wouldn't rule that out of hand. But it's conceivable that this does the trick. It also highlights something that we've revisited on multiple occasions, the importance of location as the empire crumbles, being in an area where there are people like you who believe the same things that you do and who are friends rather than enemies. The blatant corruption of the American legal system that's on display here is not somehow separate from the population more broadly. YouGov had a poll just a little over a week ago, where respondents were asked whether or not they thought Trump should be, not would be, but should be convicted in this case of the 34 or whatever it was felony counts. And the results for people who, if they're following the trial at all, were following it probably through corporate media sources or just gathering what they saw online or maybe reading secondhand accounts of it, spending 10, 15 minutes, maybe 30 minutes at most a day for those who were really following the news closely, and that's a very small sliver of the population. None of those surveyed could have possibly had been conceited enough to believe that they had all the knowledge that the jurors did who were making the decision. And the basis of the American judicial system, the way that the jury system is supposed to work, is that if you are not privy to the entire case, the entire trial as it plays out, then it's a little difficult to say with conviction whether or not, from a legal perspective, someone should be convicted. And yet we see the partisan divide on the question of whether or not Trump should be convicted of these felony counts, again, a week before the deliberations occurred and the jury rendered its verdict. We see that among Democrats, 83% said yes, he should be convicted, and just 6% said no. The residual 12% saying that they didn't have enough information. And on the Republican side, there was the almost virtual inverse, with 6% saying yes, he should be convicted, and 82% saying no, with again 12% saying they were unsure. Over the next week, we'll get a battery of polling results with this conviction included in the questions. Previous polling back months ago showed that a non-trivial number of Republicans expressed hesitancy to support Trump if he was convicted. But I'm skeptical. I don't think it's going to change the numbers among public support really at all in either direction. as this polling data we just referenced showed, it wasn't just in the courtroom that the case was overtly political. It was politicized outside of the courtroom in the court of public opinion, really from the beginning. And on Thursday, when the convictions were announced, the betting markets slid about 3% unfavorable to Trump and favorable to Biden. But within 24 hours, that very marginal shift had completely reversed, and the odds were exactly back to where they had been Wednesday before the verdict had been announced. I think there are some second-order effects from the convictions that are worth discussing. I think it provides a potential pretense to duck the debates entirely for the Biden team if they would be able to try to have the cake and eat it too by saying that we were willing to debate, we set them up, but that was in the understanding that this was a real election between two American citizens and not between a convicted felon who shouldn't be allowed to vote or shouldn't be allowed to roam free, let alone run for president. Sentencing, purely coincidentally, of course, is set to take place 4 days before the start of the Republican National Convention. How Trump turns himself in if he is convicted and is sentenced to incarceration, whether or not he turns himself in at all, will be interesting. How others, allies of Trump, and how other Republicans will react, how the RNC the convention itself will be conducted with the shadow of the sentencing hanging over it is all quite interesting. I'm a little bit giddy about it because I can't think of anything better to push forward political dissolution than this. It sounds cliched, but it's a cliche because it's true. This is like Banana Republic, third world stuff where the justice system is twisted like a pretzel to political ends, and in a city that has people having their jaws broken in broad daylight and people being pushed onto train tracks and those resulting in no convictions at all or in misdemeanor charges, and then an alleged bookkeeping error that ended up there's a Monopoly card, there's a chance card where it says like bank makes an error in your favor, collect $15. Well, that was the consequence of what the charges that Trump is alleged to have, the disguised payment. I don't know all of the details, but the upshot of it was that it was disfavorable for the Trump organization to classify the expense the way that they did. They would have been able to take a tax deduction if they would have done it the quote right unquote way, but the way that it was booked actually increased the tax bill, and that was one of the three potential alleged legal reasons for the conviction. It was another thing that was very odd about the trial, that the jurors didn't have to come up with or didn't have to agree on the exact violation, the charge that Trump was guilty of, the instructions, which the jury foreman came and asked the judge to have a written copy provided to them, and that was denied. But apparently the oral instructions from the judge were that of the three different possible convictions, as long as a juror thought that Trump was guilty of at least one of them, even if the jurors were split on each of the charges. And so there might be one charge that four jurors thought he was guilty of, another charge that four jurors thought he was guilty of, and another charge that the other four jurors thought he was guilty of, but the residuals thought he was not guilty. So there were 8 jurors saying he was not guilty of charge A, 8 jurors saying he was not guilty of charge B, and 8 jurors saying he was not guilty of charge C. As long as there were 4 saying he was of A, 4 of B, and 4 of C, then they would get the conviction. Not a lawyer and out of my league here as far as the legal reasoning goes, but and my knowledge is secondhand, but I'm taking that from legal minds that I do trust, and it seems to be overwhelmingly the consensus is that this was the shoddiest, most flimsily prepared case to have an unprecedented conviction of a former president and current leading candidate for a second term imaginable. And again, that's why I think this is such a good outcome if the collapse of the American empire is an outcome that you believe to be one, while it won't be pretty and it won't be painless, is necessary for the remnant of Western civilization to flourish and not be snuffed out entirely. why this is a good outcome, because it so clearly exposes the lie that there is some sort of constitutional republic governed by laws rather than by men operating. It is just naked friend versus enemy distinction. This is Schmittian territory, if ever we've been there in American history.
I think there's a good chance that the charges will get overturned on appeal. Number one issue would be the statute of limitations. I have not heard a legitimate reason why they were able to bypass the statute of limitations in this case. There could also be an issue with federal versus state jurisdiction, the fact that a state court is potentially overstepping the bounds and going into areas that the federal government has preemption on. Also the New York Court of Appeals, which is actually the highest level court in the state of New York. Interestingly, the trial courts in New York are called Supreme Courts. So the highest court in the state of New York is not as left wing as you might think. It's somewhat moderate. Apparently, the Republicans at a certain point in the state of New York held majority in the House, and they were able to negotiate some sort of arrangement with Andrew Cuomo, governor at the time. So all that's to say that the composition of the highest court in New York is relatively moderate, and so there's a good chance, I think, or at least a decent chance, that once it's appealed, the highest court in New York would overturn it. And then also, if it is able, I can't speak to all the procedural hurdles it would have to get through to get up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But if it gets there, I think there's a good chance that at least some of the charges could be overturned as well. And the underlying crime in this case is a misdemeanor. It is the cover-up and subsequent actions that make it a felony. And there is some precedent that indicates that certain courts do not look well on that sort of thing, and so they could potentially overturn it on that basis. So all that is to say that there are various reasons to think that once this case gets appealed, that it could get overturned. The convictions could get overturned. And apparently many Western countries do not allow convicted felons from the United States to enter their country. So apparently Trump would have to get some sort of waiver in order to travel to foreign countries.
It's worth noting, too, of course, that the Clinton campaign did the same thing with the Steele dossier. I hate using that pretentious term, but that's what it's commonly known as. That's the phrase that everyone is familiar with. The totally fabricated pretend catalyst for the absurd Russian collusion hoax. The Hillary Clinton campaign, Hillary Clinton funded that and admitted to as much, was found guilty of doing as much, and was simply given a fine, even though fake opposition research that is designed explicitly for the purpose of knocking out one's political rival to gain the elected office for oneself is much more straightforwardly criminal than the tortured logic to say that having an extramarital affair and paying for it to be covered up is somehow done primarily with political objectives in mind. And so in the case of an explicitly political fabrication being made that has led the United States and Russia to the brink of World War III and a potential nuclear exchange, results in some slap on the wrist fine, but a bookkeeping error about an alleged affair potentially could lead to Trump spending the rest of his life in prison.
Going back to the origins of this case, the underlying offense that Trump supposedly committed was paying hush money to a porn star in order to cover up the affair that I think everyone agrees that he had. The affair happened. He paid her to shut her up. He had this affair with the porn star while his wife was either pregnant or had just given birth to their son, Barron. And so it made me, at least in my mind, it made me think again about something we've discussed before on this show, is why Trump has such rock solid support among white evangelical Christians, given the questionable personal conduct. I've been reading this book called Preparing for War, The Extremist History of White Christian Nationalism and What Comes Next. It's by a man named Bradley Onishi. So this idea is explored. Why does Trump enjoy such strong support from white evangelical Christians? And so some of the theories I'm going to quote from the book. There's the argument that white heterosexual men are often forgiven of sexual transgressions such as extramarital affairs, harassment, and even abuse because their aggressive sexual behavior is actually seen as a virtue for the leader tasked with protecting the nation from invaders and extending the American empire. In some sense, they transcend the call for sexual purity because their hypermasculine aggression is read by the public as a sign of America's own prowess and strength. In other words, the moral details of our leader's illicit sex are not only irrelevant to whether he bears power, but may actually be an indication that he deserves the power he has, precisely because his sexuality proves his masculinity and thus his claim to authority. And so the theory goes, many Americans seem to accept that the figure who is asked to protect the purity of the national family may have to overstep the bounds of purity himself in order to do so. This transgression is viewed not as an unforgivable sin, but as a sign of virility and power. And so the author in this book argues that white Christian nationalists see the world as in a constant state of cosmic war, where all those opposed to them are God's enemies who will eventually be defeated. They see themselves as the true believers and true Americans, charged by God to carry out his mission on earth. Trump has been viewed as the barbarian king who is willing to fight this war without concern for civility or etiquette. Like a good strongman, he is seen as the head and protector of the American family, one who oversteps the bounds of purity in order to make it possible for a pure nation to exist. His transgressions are not only forgivable, they are signs that he is up for the job.
I don't find that convincing at all. Looking at polling data, in 2004, the first time that exit polls asked specifically about white evangelical support for presidential candidates, because up until that point in time, it was not a pejorative, but it entered the lexicon with the Bush administration and the reliance on cultural Christian conservatism as a driving force for getting out the vote. In 2004, Bush got 78% of white evangelical Christians, and John Kerry got 21%. In 2016, Trump got 80%, Hillary Clinton got 16%. In 2020, Trump got 76%, and Joe Biden got 24%. And so if you do a little simple averaging there, you see that 2016 and 2020 melded together. Trump got 78%, exactly the same percentage as George Bush got in 2004. And the Democratic candidate across 2016 and 2020 combined got 21%, which is exactly to the percentage the same support that John Kerry got in 2004. And so in terms of their public persona vis-a-vis Christianity, George Bush and Donald Trump couldn't really be any different, couldn't be any more diametrically opposed, and yet they got the exact same support, exactly the same support among white evangelicals across a generation. I think that is a similar pattern phenomenon that we saw when we discussed a couple of weeks ago about Hispanic support and the assertion that Trump is winning big among Hispanics relative to previous Republicans. And we looked at the polling results and saw that no, his support is exactly in line with what Mitt Romney got and what George Bush got and what Republicans have gotten, as long as Hispanics have been broken up as a separate category in exit polling results. And in 2016, in the Republican primaries, the first state and the one that was close in terms of final results, you look at one of the closest in terms of final results was Iowa. And in Iowa, among evangelical Christians, Ted Cruz got 34% of Republican voters. Donald Trump just got 22%. And then among non-evangelicals, Cruz only got 18%, whereas Trump got 29%. So Cruz got about twice as much evangelical support among Republicans as Trump did. And this idea that Ted Cruz was some sort of alpha male Christian warrior who is going to, through sexual transgressions, or in spite of sexual transgressions, was a paragon of male virility. That's laughable on his face. Ted Cruz was made fun of during the campaign because like his wife and kids didn't even want to make contact with him. He is a dorky, nerdy intellectual. He puts on an air of being a sort of scholarly intellectual type and not a knock him down and drag him out ballroom brawler that Trump was sometimes rhetorically portrayed as, and sometimes leaned into it, but it was always tongue in cheek. And when Trump actually got the power of the presidency, he used his executive privilege much less. He was much more restrained in terms of executive power than, say, George Bush was 20 years previously. And so I think the explanation is much more mundane than the author of the book Jeff was referencing would have us believe. It is that white evangelicals vote for the person that they believe will push their interests furthest. And when that's Ted Cruz versus Donald Trump, they back Ted Cruz. But when that's Donald Trump versus Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, they back Donald Trump. More parenthetically, I think it is worth noting that Donald Trump denies the accusations, and it's not outside the realm of what occurs for people to be paid off, even if events didn't occur. When it comes to the wealthy and powerful, almost invariably they are paying people not to do things for them, but are paying people to be quiet. And also, it's worth mentioning that while evangelicals emphasize certain areas of the Bible more than others, polygamy is not at all prohibited in the Old Testament. Now, adultery, of course, is, and so it's more the issue not so much of having sex with other women while married or while a certain wife is pregnant that has a biblical prohibition on it. It's having sex with women at all outside of the bonds of marriage. And so from a purely scriptural perspective, we could argue that had Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump gotten married in Vegas the night before, the one night stand or however long the duration of the affair was, and they got divorced afterwards, that it would not be out. There would not be an explicit biblical prohibition on that. Recollating back to the fallout from the conviction, the mugshot of Trump in an actual yellow prison outfit is going to be iconic. And it's interesting too, we're entering really a Caesarean situation now, potentially, where Trump is in a situation where if he's fighting for his not just political future, but his personal freedom in the same way that Julius Caesar was when he was fighting for his election as consul, where if he did not win the consulship, he was sure, and the protection that was afforded to him for his generalship and his proconsulship in Gaul, if that was to lapse and he didn't have an official position in the Roman state, he was going to be arrested. But if he won consulship, then he would continue to be protected. Well, that situation is similar, not exactly the same, but similar to the situation Trump finds himself in, where if he wins the presidency, presumably he will pardon himself of any of these felony convictions, and then of the other three ongoing cases of any of those landing convictions, presumably he would pardon himself in those cases as well.
Well, he won't be able to pardon himself for the New York crimes because the president only has the right to pardon federal crime.
Oh, well, if he has to get, the governor of New York to do that for him, then I presume that wouldn't happen. So hopefully instead we get an Andrew Jackson situation where he says that the state of New York has made its conviction. Now let them come and enforce it.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for listening to The Reality Taboo. Talk with you next time.